Good evening. My name is Gwendolyn Moore. I am the curator of urban landscape and community identity here at the Missouri Historical Society. On behalf of MHS, I would like to welcome you to this St. Louis History Live broadcast. We're really excited to have you join us here virtually, so thank you for being here. I'd also like to introduce you to our presenter, Professor Walter Johnson, who's just written a very important book, The Broken Heart of America, St. Louis and the Violent History of the United States. So Professor Johnson, thank you for being here with us tonight. Okay. Before we get started, I just need to mention a few details, so bear with us. It's about how the program is going to run tonight. Closed captioning is being provided. To turn it on, you can scroll to the closed caption button along the toolbar on your screen. This will be a roughly 30-minute presentation with 20 or 30 minutes for question and answer. You can submit your questions through the Q&A button in your toolbar. Please know that we're going to do everything we can to try and answer as many questions as we can, but we might not be able to get to all of them. So I apologize for that. And lastly, tonight's presentation is being recorded. So if you'd like to view it again or share tonight's presentation, it will be posted on our Missouri Historical Society YouTube channel, probably early next week. I know that some of you that are watching are members of the Missouri Historical Society, so thank you. We're grateful for your support. And if you're not a member, we would love for you to consider joining today. You can see a link to our website in the chat box. We also sincerely thank city and county residents for your tax contributions to the Zoo Museum Tax District. And before we begin, I'd just like to mention that Professor will be here live and in person in St. Louis at Left Bank Books, August the 13th.
August the 13th.
August the
13th.
August the 13th, good, thank you. And I would encourage you to buy his book. You can order it from Left Bank Books, and I would say do that quickly because they're going very quickly. It's a very popular book on its way to becoming a bestseller. So congratulations, Professor Johnson. So let me give you Professor Johnson's bio. Walter Johnson is the Winthrop Professor of History and Professor of African and African American Studies at Harvard University. He is the author of River of Dark Dreams and Soul by Soul, which won the Frederick Jackson Turner Award, the Avery O. Craven Award, and several other prizes. His new book, as I've mentioned before, is The Broken Heart of America, St. Louis and the Violent History of the United States. He is a Missouri native and he lives in Arlington, Massachusetts. And let me just say a few things about the book, which I read and couldn't put it down, by the way. The Broken Heart of America is groundbreaking. It is a sweeping in scope, covering some 200 years of St. Louis history, from Lewis and Clark, 1804, to the tragic killing of Michael Brown and the Ferguson Uprising in 2014. It is exhaustively researched with a compelling and forceful argument. It has a lot of hard truths, but the operative word here is truths. And these are truths that we need to confront and address if we hope to move forward. And I'm going to quote Drew Gilpin Foss, who was the first female president of Harvard University. But she says, we have to move forward, and we have to move forward to a just and equitable society. With that, I want to quote one more thing, and then I'll turn it over to Professor Johnson. And this is a quote that's on the inside cover of the dust jacket. It's from Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, author of An Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States. And this is what she says: this may be the most important book on United States history you will read in your lifetime. That's quite an endorsement. Professor Johnson.
Well, I want to begin by asking everyone to lower their expectations, but thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, Gwen. Thanks to the Missouri History Museum, to Lindsay Newton for organizing, to Gwen Moore for moderating, and for the inspiration of the First and Civil Rights exposition that was at the museum recently, several years ago. And also to Mark Laura at the museum, who did a lot of research for the book and helped me think through quite a bit of it. I want to recognize all the people on whose shoulders I stand, people who've written fantastic books and articles, done great work on the history of St. Louis. I'm not going to be able to mention them all, but I really do want to mention George Lipsitz and David Roediger, Keona Irvin, Clarence Lang, and Jamala Rogers, all of who have written insightfully about St. Louis and on whose work I rely. I also want to acknowledge that, well, I wish I was there with you all, and I'm sorry I'm not, but I want to acknowledge the circumstances of the pandemic and the historically structured racial effects of the pandemic in St. Louis and across the nation in Boston, and the way that this has fallen with especial violence upon poor working people and non-white people. And I think we all, have spent the day today and yesterday shadowed by the deliberate killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, and by the uprising there, which brings back so many of the images and feelings and many of the unresolved issues that I think came into national consciousness in Ferguson. And so I wouldn't say it's an auspicious moment to be talking to you, but it is it's a dense moment. The book was, in my mind, framed as a history of St. Louis between the Lewis and Clark expedition and the killing of Michael Brown, the uprising, and there's a couple of dimensions of that I want to emphasize and talk about tonight. One is the relationship between imperialism, U.S. empire, and anti-Blackness. Another is that this is a history of racism, of capitalism, of white supremacy and empire, but it's also a history of racial resistance and of interracial resistance, of cooperative efforts between white and Black radicals at several moments in the history of St. Louis that I believe stand out actually in the history of the United States for their vision and the possibilities that they represent. Finally, and I'm going to talk less about this tonight in my organized remarks, to the extent that remarks that I make are ever organized. It's about St. Louis as a place. It's about the material, economic, ecological, and the social relations that structure the physical environment of the city and life within it. And so, if people want to talk a little bit about that in the Q&A, I would be happy to. The book begins with the history of the United States Empire. Well, the book begins with the Mounds and Cahokia, but the sort of narrative argument of the book kicks off with the Lewis and Clark expedition, the reconnaissance mission up the Missouri River to see what sort of economic possibility lay up the river, and particularly to investigate the possibility of the fur trade. And the fur trade world, as I portray it, as I think it existed at the beginning of the 19th century, was a world where the trade was largely conducted on Indian ground in terms that were set by Native Americans. Gradually, and this is part of the story that I tell in the first chapter of the book, and violently, control over the fur trade was wrested from Native Americans and came under the control, the fuller control of the fur companies. The book moves on to discuss the long history of Indian removal and the Indian wars on the plains. And I argue that St. Louis played an overlooked role in the imperial history an often overlooked role in the imperial history of the United States in the 19th century. St. Louis was where the United States Superintendent of Indian Affairs for much of the West, William Clark, from 1822 to 1838, had his office. and it was the site of Jefferson Barracks. And Jefferson Barracks was the headquarters of the United States Army Department of the West throughout the 19th century. And virtually all of the Indian wars in the West, up in even up into the up to the end of the 19th century, were either staged out of or supported from Jefferson Barracks. And so Jefferson Barracks was, particularly in the first, particularly up until about 1840, was absolutely central to the United States vision of its Western empire. And thereafter, it played a sort of a, not really a secondary role, but it wasn't the, no longer were frontline soldiers at Jefferson Barracks, but the forts further west were being supported from Jefferson Barracks. And so St. Louis was an imperial city. I call it the morning star of US imperialism in the West. And of thus Indian killing and expropriation, removal, and in several instances, genocide. One of the central arguments of the book is that the removal as a kind of tool of population management, as an ideology of racial control, was carried over from the empire to the management of free people of color, of African Americans in Missouri. And so there's a contrast that I'm trying to draw between the anti-Blackness of the West and the anti-Blackness of the South. And so let me try to explain to you briefly what I mean. In the South, there's in slavery, there is a no shortage of anti-Blackness. There's no shortage of racism. But there's also an emphasis on Black reproduction, Black futurity, because the reproduction of the system of slavery over time depends upon the reproduction of African American people. What I think you see in the history of St. Louis, of Missouri, and of the West more generally, is the emergence of a removalist anti-Blackness. A anti-Blackness focused on the idea not of exploiting Black people for labor or for reproduction, but of getting rid of them entirely. And so I spend a good deal of time on the Missouri Compromise debate and the Dred Scott decision, and the various the state constitution of 1820 and various laws following on the state constitution of 1820, all of which were very strongly inflected with the idea of removing or banning free people of color from the state of Missouri, and with the idea of the white man's country. And I illustrate what it means, what the dimensions of the ideology of the white man's country in various ways. One of which is just a simple quotation from Frank Blair, who represented St. Louis in the United States House of Representatives for a time, was Lincoln's Attorney General and confidant. The races of the continent, or the brother that was related to Lincoln's Attorney General. The races of the continent can only flourish if separated from one another. Whites in the temperate central latitudes, Blacks in the tropics, and Indians pressed out to the margins. So this is the type of removalism, the conjoining of the vision of empire as practiced in relationship to Native Americans, and then as practiced in relationship to African Americans, that I see at the heart of the history of 19th century St. Louis, and really at the heart of the strain of imperialist, white supremacist, anti-slavery that became the bedrock of the Free Soil wing of the Republican Party in the Civil War. The book then follows that strain of thought through a series of expropriations and patterns of exploitation. To the East St. Louis race massacre in 1917, which is, and I'm going to go quickly, but what I'm trying to signal in each instance is that there's both a enduring, and there's a repetition of the form of racism. There's a repetition of removal, but it's matched with a different kind of set of economic relations in every instance. And so what I'm trying to get at here is a kind of a back and forth relationship, a sort of a way that that repeating removals are the result of changes in the political economy of race and labor in St. Louis. So in East St. Louis, there's a dual labor market in 1917 where the bosses, you know, the owners and the managers are using African Americans who have migrated from the South as sort of reserve labor in order to discipline white laborers. And it comes to a head in 1917 at a strike at the aluminum ore plant in Allerton. What begins as a conflict over labor turns into an effort to drive, it turns into an attack on Black neighborhoods. It turns into an attack on Black women and children. It turns into the destruction of thousands of dwellings, burning out women and children, shooting them in the street, and driving as many as 5,000 people across the bridge, the pedestrian bridge to St. Louis, as well as killing an untold number. You know, the official figure was 39. I think it's reasonable to imagine that it was somewhere in the 100 or 200 people were killed. And the book then follows what's almost an arc, a historical arc from East St. Louis through various different moments and removals. From East St. Louis to Mill Creek Valley, which was torn down in 1959, more or less as a large-scale effort to change the value of real estate in the city as a real estate redevelopment project. So it's a different kind of capital that's at stake, but also as a way to create a lot of jobs for. It was initially imagined as a project that would create jobs for white soldiers returning from the Second World War. That involved the almost total destruction of 20,000 acres of land in the heart of St. Louis. Many of you are very familiar with. Of 5,000 acres, I'm sorry, the displacement of 20,000 people, and the destruction of as many as 800 community institutions, you know, churches, businesses. And it occurred, as is evident on the landscape today, without any real practicable plan in place for the replacement of that community. And without a sustained attention to where people will go. Some of those people made their way, although not as many as were promised, into the Pruitt-Igoe housing project. And in Pruitt-Igoe, I argue there was a different kind of complex, which was a kind of a military, industrial, academic complex, which used the Black inhabitants of Pruitt-Igoe as a resource for knowledge production. The Army Chemical Corps, in cooperation with Washington University, in cooperation with Stanford University, from 1963 to 1965, did airborne radiological weapons tests in the Pruitt-Igoe housing project. And it's not entirely clear to this day what exactly was in the fog that was released over the housing project. It is, however, clear that the rate of the degree to which children born in St. Louis had strontium-90 in their baby teeth is changed 50 times, depending on whether or not they were born after 1963. That, for me, epitomizes what is a very strong subplot in the book, which is that strategies of control and violence and exploitation that begin as racialized strategies are frequently generalized to the population at large. And so what we see then in Pruitt-Igoe a wanton sort of experimentation being done on an African-American population, but because of the way that it's being done, because of the wantonness, its effects spread throughout the city. The book finishes with an account of North City and North County today, and with the fate of a population that has become economically surplus from the standpoint of production. A population that is under and unemployed, and has been municipally abandoned. And so there's a fairly long and harrowing account of what I see as the municipal abandonment of the North Side in particular, focused on the closing of Homer G. Phillips Hospital in 1979. And I think that what we see today on the North Side and in North County is people being rendered up for a last round of extraction. Payday loans, for-profit policing, corporate welfare through tax abatements that are justified as addressing inequality, but actually increase inequality, and mass incarceration. All of these are ways of making money off of people who have been rendered, who've been abandoned and rendered inert from the standpoint of labor and production. It's a hard story. And it's the story that I thought that I would find when I began working on St. Louis, but alongside that story, I found something else. And it's something that is not, I think, as frequently amplified in the reviews of the book, and maybe even in the way that people feel about the book, but it certainly has been there with me the entire time that as I've learned about the history of St. Louis. And that's the radical history of St. Louis, the Black radical interracial history of St. Louis, which has been vexed and embattled, but is too often forgotten in mainstream accounts of the history of the United States, of the American left, and I think in accounts of the city itself, and I think is too scarcely memorialized in the physical fabric of the city. We could trace that all the way back to Native Americans who resisted the proletarianization of the fur trade, to escaping slaves, William Wells Brown, arguably the first African-American novelist in the United States, Lucy Delaney, who wrote one of the very few narratives published by a formerly enslaved African-American woman in the 19th century. I think that of four sort of canonical 19th century enslaved women's narratives, of six, four are from St. Louis. And so again, that tells us something interesting about the history of slavery in St. Louis. I was enormously taken with the radical history of Civil War St. Louis. It is in St. Louis that the first general emancipation order in the history of the United States was issued in August of 1861. And what was behind that order was the fact that several of the most influential members of General John Fremont's staff were German revolutionaries, and indeed they were communists, Franz Sigel and Joseph Wedemeyer. Sigel was an experienced military leader from the German Revolution of 1848, and someone who believed that a total war should also be a war on the category of property, that it should be a redistributive war, that soldiers and communists should operate together, and who then took that theory and applied it to the Civil War by imagining arming escaping slaves in Missouri in 1861. And so who was well in advance of Abraham Lincoln and the United States of America. Wedemeyer was a friend and publisher, interlocutor of Marx and Engels. And he is one of the most prominent Marxist communists in the history, the intellectual history of the left in the United States. And it was Wedemeyer who was responsible for designing the artillery defense of the city of St. Louis, the Union Army artillery defense during the Civil War. And so that history of anti-slavery communism in St. Louis was not something that I had known about. And it was something that then helped me begin to follow through a real thread of radicalism that runs, I would say, up to the present day in St. Louis. I followed that thread through the general strike of 1877, which had its most radical manifestation in St. Louis, where the workers, white and black, for a moment, controlled the streets. They controlled the trains going in and out of the city. They made production decisions about what were and were not essential businesses that should be allowed to operate. That strike, what was called at the time the St. Louis Commune, was overthrown by armed vigilantes, by the state militia supported by Federal Reserves. And it was at that moment that the city's business elite reasserted control over the streets with the first Veil Prophet Parade in 1878. The radical strain was in many instances pushed back to the margins of the physical fabric of the city and the history of the city, but it remained strong through the 1930s, characterized in the 1930s between alliances between communists, many of them either themselves immigrants from Eastern Europe, Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe, or the children of Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe, and African-American radicals, particularly African-American women. And is evident in the unemployed councils of the early Depression, which demonstrated throughout the city repeatedly and successfully demanded state support before the state support for black and white workers in a way that was actually, in a way, more far-reaching than the subsequent New Deal programs. The Funston Nut Strike, again, this is an event in the history of St. Louis that I think should be understood as a central event in the history of the United States. In 1933, where black women like Carrie Smith, who said very simply, we believe that we are entitled to live as well as other folks live and should be entitled to a wage that will provide ample food and clothing, organized along with the Communist Party, with particularly communist organizer William Sentner, who was a very active figure in the labor and political history of St. Louis through the 1830s. And won a strike against one of the largest employers in the city of St. Louis at that time, and certainly the largest single employer of black women. Funston Nut in 1933 employed about 2,500 black women. And we have to imagine that we're talking about winning a strike in 1933, winning a strike right in the teeth of the Great Depression. The Emerson Electric sit-down strike of 1937, again, mostly white workers at Emerson, but supported by black workers, which went on for 53 days. It's the largest sit-down strike, second longest sit-down strike in the history of the United States. And really following on the work of Clarence Lang and Keona Irvin, again, I try to make the argument that the movement, the black movement in St. Louis was always economic in character. I'm really running out of time because I want to leave time for questions, but I want to emphasize the economic character of the Colored Clerk Circle, of the March on Washington movement, of the struggles over work in the defense industry, and finally of the struggle at Jefferson Bank. And the struggle at Jefferson Bank is where I guess I will finish. And I want to use the struggle at Jefferson Bank to help you understand that I came to see that it's not simply that the city of St. Louis had a long history of black radical organizing. I came to see in the struggle at Jefferson Bank that the city of St. Louis had a long tradition a self-conscious tradition of Black radical organizing. I understand the strike through the history of someone who it's been my honor to get to know over the course of the work on St. Louis, Percy Green. And the strike at Jefferson Bank was really the moment that Percy Green sort of entered into the movement in St. Louis as a leading figure. But when Percy Green walked the line in front of Jefferson Bank, he walked along with Herschel Walker. And Herschel Walker was a Black leader of the Communist Party who had come to St. Louis right around the time of the Funston Nut Strike, and then became the chairman of the Communist Party in St. Louis while he was working at Wagner Electric. And so Green and Walker there marching in front of the Jefferson Bank represent, I think, a kind of a continuity. But of course, from Percy Green, it's one step of remove to Jamala Rogers and to the Organization for Black Struggle, to the organizing around the Black Radical Congress in the 1990s. And Organization for Black Struggle is the organization that supported many of those who became prominent in Ferguson, who either grew up in OBS or grew up adjacent to OBS. And so people like Tef Poe. And so I think that it's possible really with that set of images to draw a direct line from the history of Herschel Walker, the history of the 1930s right up to the present. And for me, that's part of what I think when I try to understand why it was that Ferguson became Ferguson, right? Why was it that was the instance? It's the clash, I think, of this particular history of white supremacy and empire in St. Louis, exemplary history for the history of the United States, but also this consequential Black radical history. And so I will leave my remarks there and hopefully be able to take some of your questions.
Okay, thank you.
Just a second.
Okay, thank you, Professor Johnson. That was really quite enlightening, to say the least. Let me just say that I was one of those 20,000 people that was displaced by Mill Creek. So I really was interested in that chapter. It was eye-opening. Let me ask you a question. I don't think it's in your book, but it's something that I came across researching you. Could you tell me a little bit about the Commonwealth Project?
Sure, I am always happy to talk about that. So part of, as I've spent more time in St. Louis and got to know more people in St. Louis, I've made friends in St. Louis and been inspired by people there. And the Commonwealth Project was, I guess the official way to say it was we began with an effort to try to form a kind of a community arts collective on the North Side, and to take advantage of the the comparative availability of real estate on the North Side, and to buy a piece of property and fix it up and start an arts collective, and to foster some of the talent in the history of in St. Louis. That was a vision that I developed with Tef Poe, and it's a vision that I still hold to. That's the fancy way of saying it. The more direct way of saying it is the Commonwealth Project, and we have to keep this close just between ourselves, Gwen. It's a way of trying to launder money from Harvard to do work in St. Louis. It's been, possibly, in a way, it's been more difficult to do than I thought it would be. I think the initial vision was naive, and partly now working with Tef and with Dean Nichols, we've stepped back a little bit and tried to build some capacity and some credibility for the larger vision. And part of that, the way that we've built credibility, both at Harvard and St. Louis, is by sending Harvard students to do work in St. Louis and over the summer. And I think they've done very, very consequential work. They've worked with Equal Housing Opportunity, the Metropolitan Equal Housing Opportunity Council, and Equity Legal Services, which is on the east side in Centerville, Illinois, where there's a terrible problem with stormwater and sewage, and helped to create a press kit for that. And they're helping to do some oral histories in Centerville. They worked in Creve Coeur.
I get up and go
The
closer.
history of Bernie Park.
I can't see that.
Trying to get the name change, which I saw just the other day that the sign has gone up, honoring Dr. Venable, who was turned out of his house to create Bernie Park in Creve Coeur, now Venable Park. They work with the track team, the RC Striders,
Will I
on
be
the
off screen?
north side. And then most recently, we've set up a photo fellowship where we had 6 young African-American St. Louis photographers matched with 6 artists from Harvard, undergraduate artists, to produce an exhibition that was going to be to show at the Griot, go up at the Griot in March, and then come to Harvard at the end of April. As with all of these projects, unfortunately, a lot of it has been undermined and for the moment put on hold by the virus. But it's my hope that we'll be able to. We have students working this summer remotely. Some at the Griot, some doing oral history, some working in Centerville, and it's my hope that we'll be able to continue to build and do work in St. Louis. Thank
you so much. Well, I'm going to go ahead with some of the Q&A from some of our viewers here. The first question is from Brian Esselman, and he asks, is there a way for resistance or protests to operate effectively within a capitalist framework, or must it seek to subvert it?
Well, I think there is a way for protests to operate. I mean, it sort of depends on what you mean by within a capitalist framework. I think there is a way that protest operates very effectively in our society today, and it is a very thoroughly capitalist society. My particular turn of mind is I don't believe that we will have a genuinely anti-racist society until we have found a different way than capitalism around the question of organizing labor and distribution. And so it is a very, it's a revolutionary vision. And I think it's an abolitionist vision. It's one which tries to imagine us, how is it that we as people can learn to relate to one another in an anti-capitalist, anti-racist, anti-sexist manner, and to build a society in which we no longer need the forms of violent discipline that characterize this society, police and the prisons. And that's really, that's the heart of my ethical vision. It's a long-term ethical vision, but it's also one which takes inspiration from what I see as fragments of the future. And so one of the things that the book ends with a set of images of people in the history of St. Louis doing, I think, wonderful visionary work. And I see people already building this society. People are already building a new society in the interstices of this one. And that's where I try to finish the book. And that's something that really I have learned from watching the way that people at work and move in the city of St. Louis.
Okay, this question is from Crystal, and I might be mispronouncing her last name, Buerline. Do you think the price St. Louis paid for not embracing the creative influence and energy that African Americans could have brought to the city had they been allowed to, was the falling behind Chicago as the most important city in the Midwest for the United States?
It's a complicated question. Because so much of the economic history of St. Louis and of the United States of America has different kinds of imperial and global predicates. I do feel as if I do feel that the imperialism and particularly the ongoing anti-Blackness in the city have held it back. And have held the city back from the type of flourishing and development that many of those who have been the most complicit in the marginalization and exploitation of African Americans hold so dearly. And I do think that the future of the city will be, and you know, and this is not just about St. Louis. This is Boston, and this is the history of the United States. Will be determined by the extent to which inequality and white supremacy can be eliminated, you know, in relationship to one another. I really do believe that our common future depends upon the development of a much more humane, loving, and democratic vision of what you know, what a city is, or what a community is, or what a nation is.
One of the things that you said almost from the outset is that St. Louis is not unique in its racial history, but it's extreme.
Right.
Could you expound on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think St. Louis is exemplary, and I think it's exemplary because it's the place where a lot of the tools were pioneered, and but it's important for me to say to people, you know, it's not that I think that people in in St. Louis are uniquely morally suspect. You know, what I think is that there's a set of conditions that emerge in St. Louis that frame the history of St. Louis extremely, and that those conditions are powerful enough that they create extreme actions on the part of people and extreme ideologies. And so I see St. Louis as an exemplary city, and really as one that's you could argue is exemplary for the history of the Midwest. I mean, it's very, very hard for me not to look at what's happening in Minneapolis and see that as a reflection of a history that I have come to learn about, and I think that was pioneered in St. Louis. And there's, you know, in Minneapolis, a very similar span from the history of Indian removal and the Indian Wars and expropriation to the present. And so it's, but I guess part of what I am trying to say is the things that I am identifying through and understanding through the history of St. Louis are the history of the United States. And so that there's not a, that I view St. Louis as a way of understanding the history of the United States, not as a simple kind of unique outlier.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is an interesting question from Katie. She goes back to the freedom suits. And she asks, how do you interpret the inclusion in early Missouri law, the provision that allowed enslaved people to file freedom suits? Was there an economic motivation behind it?
Those are actually common. There's provisions in all of the slaveholding states which allow people to petition courts for wrongful enslavement. And I actually view those as part of the way that slaveholders try to convince themselves that they're creating a morally just order, is that they set up a set of petitioning projects which address sort of marginal cases, in a significant number, an existentially significant number of cases from the standpoint of African Americans who sue and gain their freedom, but an inconsequential number of cases from the standpoint of the institution of slavery. And there's a legal mechanism then which makes the system itself seem just, right? It's a justifying mechanism. It says that, well, that there are cases of unjust enslavement, and we will address those. And the implication, of course, is that all of the other cases of enslavement are just. And so one then gets a legal and philosophical distinction between kidnapping, i.e. taking somebody who is legally born free and carried into enslavement as a crime, whereas slavery, which one could in another moral universe imagine as a form of kidnapping itself, is characterized as legal. So I think they're extremely interesting, but I think that they are fully understandable within the legal, moral, and philosophical parameters of a pro-slavery society.
Okay, Steve Singer, I think, has an interesting question. And he says, I'm a lifelong St. Louis, and was completely fascinated with your descriptions and insights into the World's Fair. 1904 World's Fair, which is often valorized in St. Louis. So he has, what has always been related as the height of St. Louis position to him? Any additional comments?
Well, I think I read at length about the World's Fair, and I think in a way, the World Fair was, it was an apogee of American empire and American imperial ambition, as well as the sort of apogee of the cultural history of the city, the felt, remembered, mythologized, legendary cultural history of the city of St. Louis. I have a much more jaundiced view of the fair than many, based upon the fact that I think it is fair to argue that the fair contained the largest human zoo perhaps in the history of the world. And so a lot of the fair exhibits were focused on establishing a kind of a notion of the hierarchy of the racial and civilizational hierarchy of human beings, and making the case that certain kinds of improvement were possible, certain kinds of racial improvement, limited racial improvement was possible through imperial tutelage of the darker peoples of the world by the Anglo-Saxon people of the United States. And so it really was a kind of a very, very self-conscious exhibit of imperial global racial hierarchy. So I am not one of those who writes nostalgically about the history of the World's Fair in 1904.
This is a question from an anonymous attendee, and it's really a question I was pondering as well. You haven't really used the term racial capitalism in this short presentation, but could you explain the role of capitalism, and especially what you mean by racial capitalism in your writings?
Yes, so I tried to just for talking to you all tonight to try to I tried to take out what some people see as the academic jargon, but really what the book is framed as a history of racial capitalism, and really what I mean by that is that I believe that the history of capitalism and the history of racism in the United States are inextricable from one another. And that doesn't mean that they are timeless. It doesn't mean it's just racism over and over again. It means that they develop elected. You ask me an academic question, you're going to get an academic answer. Of transformations in political economy and transformations in racial ideology. And so when I describe the different moments in the history of St. Louis. What I was actually trying to do was to gesture at the fact that as the political economy of St. Louis changes, so too do the strategies of racial control, and so too do ideas, racist ideas about Native American people or African American people. Really, I think that for me then, what I'm trying to signal is imagining a history of both capitalism and of white supremacy that take the slave trade and take the colonization of North America as central events, and that have their moral and analytical center there, and then see the subsequent history is as a history of the mutual development of racism and capitalism to begin with in the Atlantic world. That's in debt to particularly the work of Cedric Robinson in his book Black Marxism. I've written a little bit. I've had a piece in the Boston Review called "To Remake the World," which explains a little bit better what I'm trying to say. I think the person to whom I really look is, well, George Lipsitz in his article and book, The Possessive Investment in Whiteness, the work of David Roediger. There's a fantastic book written with David Roediger and Elizabeth Esch called The Race and I think it's called The Production of Difference, and particularly the work of Robin Kelley. And there's a great YouTube video of a talk that Robin Kelley gave at the Simpson Center at the University of Washington, and Ruth Wilson Gilmore in her, I think, monumental book Golden Gulag, which really elucidates the relationship of race, capitalism, state power in writing a history of mass incarceration in the state of California.
Okay, this is going to have to be our last question. I'm really sorry because there's so many great ones. And this is about Percy Green. I just want to say Percy Green, of course, is one of my heroes, along with Herschel Walker. I'm so glad you talked about him in the book. And I just want to mention some of the women, too, that are some of my heroines.
Carrie Smith and Orly Malone. I mean,
Orly Malone, but even further back, I'll say Pearl Maddox, Bertie Bill Anderson, Bonnie Rose and Billy Teenu, who were members of CORE. So yeah, I just want to throw those in there,
right.
Okay? But the question is from Dave Berlin. He said, Percy Green comes alive in your book. If appropriate, please share some stories about him and his use of humor in the time of Jefferson Bank, and really the time of action, because he really—
Well, right, and so, you know, I try to write about the humor. I try to write, I mean, Percy Green is, you know, is, as I say, become a friend to me, and anyone who knows him knows that there's, you know, that his soul burns with justice, but that it burns with justice and with a sense of mischief. And so one of the things I think that so many of the actions that Action took, there was a sort of a theatricality to them. I mean, it's obvious, like whether it's climbing the arch along with Richard Daley in 1964 to shut down construction on the arch, or whether it's the you know, smearing. I mean, how am I going to say this in a public lecture, right? Smearing dog shit all over the walls of, I think this was a Laclede gas action, because racism is stinky, or the notion of people lining up at Jefferson Bank and just clogging Jefferson Bank to get change for a single dollar because change is slow, right? And then, of course, the epic set of efforts to unveil the prophet that culminated finally in Kiel Auditorium. All of these have, as well as being operationally complex, these are actions which call attention to the absurdity of things, to the absurdity of the standing order, and I think call attention then to the absurdity of the situation of African Americans in the United States, right? I mean, another of my intellectual heroes and now a very dear friend of mine, Cornel West, says that that African American life in the United States is framed by absurdity, by a set of absurd ideas about inferiority, right? About a set of irrational, absurd practices, violent forgettings, violent. And so I think what Action did, and this is, I think, Percy's spirit of mischief, is created political theater that gestured at absurdity.
Well, let me say, Professor Johnson, this has been much too short. This time has just flown by.
Me as well.
I'm sure that we have a lot of disappointed viewers that didn't get their questions addressed, but time is time, and I really am going to look forward to you coming here August the 13th. And I'd like to say that people that are interested in seeing you in the flesh should try and get tickets from Left Bank Books. That's August the 13th. So I look forward to being there if I can get in, which I might not be able to, but I'm going to try. So thank you. Thank you so much for sharing this.
Thank you all for taking the time and for having me. And I look forward to being able to sit with you all, sometime soon.
Hey, like I said, it was my privilege and my honor, our privilege and our honor. Thank you so much.
Okay, good night, y'all.
Good night. Let me just say a few more things before we close out. We would love for you to join us next time. There are 2 to 3 St. Louis history live programs each week. You can see the next listed here on your screen. There they are up there. Also, we encourage you to check out Walter Johnson's St. Louis appearance, like I said before, August the 13th. I'll say it again, a link to purchase tickets to this event is in our chat box. You can visit MissouriHistory.org, mohistory.org, or Facebook to check out more upcoming virtual programming. And let me just say, your feedback is always important to us. We would really appreciate it if you could take our short survey. A Kobo toolbox survey should have opened almost in another browser tab for you. So keep an eye out for that when you leave this session. So thank you again for joining us this evening, and see you next time. We appreciate your support. Thank you.